Hello and welcome to Digital Photography's I3 lecture series. We are thrilled to have Tema Stauffer as tonight's guest lecturer. Tema is a photographer and writer as well as a curator. She graduated from Oberlin College in 1995 and received an MFA in photography from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 1998. In 2010, she was awarded an AOL 25 for 25 grant for innovation in the arts. She is the recipient of the 2012 Women in Photography LTI Lightside Individual Project Grant and a Camera Club of New York 2014 Darkroom Residency for her documentary portrait series, Paterson. Most recently, her work was awarded in the Outwin Buschever Portrait Competition and exhibited at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery. New York exhibitions include Sasha Wolf Gallery, Jen Beckman Gallery, and Daniel Cooney Fine Art. Her photographs were also featured in the 2010 Houston Photo Fest Biennial, the Museum of Contemporary Photography Chicago, the Lishui Photography Festival, the Terra Museum of American Art, Moti Hasson Gallery, and the Randall Scott Gallery. Tema's work has been published in the New York Times, the New Statesman, the Chicago Reader, the City Pages, the Village Voice, and W Magazine. Tema, I know that in a couple weeks you're off to Montreal to accept a visiting assistant professor at Concordia University. So best luck to you and welcome to our lecture series.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Jaime for inviting me. It's really such an honor, and I really appreciate that he came up here from DC for tonight, and thank you all it's a hot night and we're in a hot room, but I appreciate you being here. And as he mentioned, I'm about to leave New York after being in New York for 9 years and make this move with my partner to Montreal. And so it's an exciting moment and also a lot of many months of sort of reflecting on these past 9 years. But I'm going to go further back into, I'm from the Midwest, and as Jaime mentioned, I studied photography at Oberlin and then went to grad school in Chicago at University of Illinois. And I'm starting with the first project I made after graduate school, which is Chicago Police Ride-Alongs. During the year 2000, there was an organization, Chicago in the year 2000, that invited photographers to create images documenting Chicago in the year 2000 for an archive that now exists in the library at the University of Illinois. And based on some of the work I'd done in graduate school, I met with the editor, and we came to the sort of understanding together that I would work on a project going out with police officers and photographing different aspects of life in Chicago from the sort of perspective or from their experiences. So it was the kind of experience where I didn't really know, each time I go out on one of these ride-alongs, what we would encounter. And this scene was an incident where the call was about a dog who was dying, was either rabid or poisoned in a parking lot, and it was a very kind of haunting moment to actually show up at the police officers and watch the dog take its last breaths. And this image is of one of the officers sort of showing confiscated rifles from a Chicago housing project. And usually when we would arrive at a scene, it was sort of after the event rather than during, and often the calls were about domestic violence incidents. It seemed like the majority of the calls would be in that about that, and these were two just witnesses to the incident. So oftentimes what I was photographing wasn't what happened, but sort of the aftermath and the residual, the emotion and the impact on people of something that had happened. This young girl was one of the last remaining residents. She and her grandmother lived in one of the housing projects, and during that year, a lot of the projects were being evacuated because there was a sort of controversial decision that it was a failed experiment and that it was causing more problems, and therefore many people were having to leave the homes that they had lived in for decades. And so I arrived with the police officers to sort of for them to speak with the girl and her grandmother about leaving their home. And this is an interior with a portrait of Malcolm X. And the projects are in the background, so you can see what these buildings are like. And this was a basketball game in the parking lot, or in the basketball court. And these are two young girls who were just standing around. So oftentimes I was just photographing sort of people in these locations that we arrived at. This image here is of a blood stain on a sidewalk after an argument between a police officer and someone who was drinking in public. And so I oftentimes sort of witnessed the interactions between the police officers and the community, which sometimes was confrontational, and other times there were people very, relieved, and I sort of saw both the extremes of, the good cop and the bad cop, and the bad cop and racial profiling, and the good cop and someone who was really more like a social worker in the community, and the different reactions of people during these calls. This scene was about a man who had died, an older man who had died of natural causes in his apartment. And when we came in, we saw the body in the bathroom. And I photographed that, as well as the police officers carrying the bag outside of the apartment. Felt like ultimately I chose this image because it was less explicit, but there's sort of, the narrative is implied. And I think the space really sort of communicates the feeling of this tragedy. And after I left Chicago at the end of this year, and I moved to Minneapolis, and I sort of started a very different body of work, which ultimately I call American Stills. And it really started with this image that I shot in northern Michigan. I was on vacation with my family and just had my camera in the car on a tripod, and was really just struck by the light and color, and made this long exposure. And then later, when I was sort of looking at this image, it shaped this sort of new method of making images, this new sort of, these unpopulated spaces, these American spaces. One of the essays that I like to share with my students that really resonated with me was an essay by Gregory Crutzen that he wrote about Edward Hopper's influence on his work and influence on other American photographers and filmmakers like Diane Arbus and Robert Frank and Stephen Shore. And I really feel like the sort of feelings of looking for solitude and beauty and mystery in the American spaces was sort of what directed this work. And there's to me a kind of Hopper core at the bottom of that. And so at this point I'm living in the Midwest and making these road trips, either near or far, and these are setting up my camera on a tripod and making very long exposures. This is in Minnesota winter, kind of on the outskirts of town. So, usually there's a kind of juxtaposition between the man-made environment and the natural landscape, and a really, attention to the quality of light and just the relationship, sort of psychological relationship between the various elements of the space. And this was made, I often made pictures when I was traveling in between Minneapolis and my parents' home, which is in Michigan. So on that drive of I-94, I would sort of get off the highway and drive around. And so this was made in a truck stop. And it was really the feeling of that kind of greenish, overcast glow and this empty, coming into this empty room, that was interesting to me. So I had started to show this work in New York at Jen Beckman Gallery, and was starting to come to New York for these openings and feel more and more involved in the New York arts community, and ultimately in 2005 I moved to New York. And one question for me was, how was I gonna continue to make work like this in New York? And what I did the first couple years that I lived in New York was just fly to another part of the country and spend a week or so making pictures. So this trip was to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, a couple weeks or maybe like a month or so afterwards. And there were so many images that were seen of New Orleans at that time, and I was really trying to make these kind of quiet images that weren't necessarily so explicit, or at least those are the ones that I kind of edited. And this is an interior in an apartment and in a house in New Orleans. So for a few years, I continued to make these trips and make this kind of work. This is in Florida. I had gone to Florida inspired by a story I was told about this town called Gibsonton. And Gibsonton is a little swampy town outside of Tampa. And the lore around Gibsonton is that it's the off-season dwelling place for circus and carny people, and it historically has been that, though its kind of heyday has kind of faded a bit. But it was actually the location of a X-Files episode, and I think other people have been sort of intrigued and made trips to Gibsonton. But again, I think I was not trying to look for the explicit culture as much as just the feeling of that past. So there's something implied rather than explicit in the photograph. And this picture to me captured a combination of sort of mystery and wonder of the horse. I went to a farm and this horse was running up and down the driveway, but also then researching the symbolism of a white horse in American folklore. It's a symbol of an impending doom. And it's also biblically, a symbol of impending death. So there's a dark undercurrent as well. So I think the picture has these sort of different magical and also like a bit of a sad element. And I also, my brother lives in Texas, and so I've spent a lot of time in the Austin area driving around and looking for pictures like these. This is in something called Dreamcatcher's Sleep Lab, which I just saw the sign driving and was sort of intrigued with the idea of this Dreamcatcher's Sleep Lab. And I had been talking to a friend that morning about like how do you photograph anxiety or kind of unfulfilled longing, which seems to be something in my 30s, that those were big themes for me to kind of work out my work. And so this room and this space kind of expressed those emotions to me. And I also made a trip out west to the Four Corners area, and this is actually in Monument Valley, which Monument Valley is one of the seven wonders of the world. And I think I wanted to avoid making kind of calendar art of this epic American landscape, but try to, I think for me, finding these cars, and it sort of spoke about America, and this was actually published in the New Statesman with an article about the decline of the American economy, and so I felt like there was sort of more meaning to me in this scene. And one of the things I remember about being in that region is that there was an incredibly kind of spooky, haunting feeling about driving around, which was kind of amazing. So these are more images made in the West. And I used pieces of folklore or stories or pieces of history to kind of give me a roadmap or a guide. There was a book, a novel, Executioner's Song, by Norman Mailer, and there was a passage that I had made an impression on me about Gary Gilmore, who was a convicted murderer and ultimately went to jail for two murders, and he had fallen in love with a woman, Nicole, and carved her name in a tree. And so I visited the town, Spanish Fork, and sort of started this impossible search to find that tree. So this image is called Field of Sad Trees. So it's really about that kind of search that I would never find that tree. And then towards the later part of making these images, I started to photograph people more. And these are two younger women in my hometown, Kalamazoo, and 3 girls in Crawford, Texas. Crawford is the former second home of the former President George Bush. And I had read an article about it in the New York Times and was kind of intrigued with what this very sort of conservative Texas town would be like. So I made a trip there and photographed these young women, and the whole identity of the town at that time really sort of surrounded the fact that it was George Bush's home. And this is a portrait that I made of someone named Fry in a parking lot of an adult video store in Austin. And I just was driving, was kind of intrigued with the Dreamers sign, and he drove up in the parking lot. So I was starting to begin this process of approaching people to ask strangers if I could make portraits of them. And he was actually really excited about it, and this is one of many outfits that he pulled out of his car and tried on while I was photographing him. And then another portrait of a pair in Austin. And I also spent a lot of time at Barton Springs, which is a swimming hole in Austin, and it was described by Robert Redford as the spiritual center of Austin, a documentary that I watched. And it was really a place that I, for one thing, really loved spending time, but also would be able to find people that were potentially open to being photographed. So I would spend a lot of time there and photographing whoever was interesting. And then in the fall of 2008, the beginning of the fall of 2008, at the beginning of the onset of the economic crisis, I had started seeing somebody who lived in Binghamton, New York, and I was making trips there on the bus. And the town, it's a small city that in some ways reminded me of my Midwestern background where I grew up. And I had a conversation with a friend who was teaching a theater class, and he had given an assignment to his students to create a piece that resonated, a piece related to a song that resonated with their hopes and dreams. And that led to a conversation where we started talking about a song called The Ballad of Sad Young Men, which is a song that's had sort of historical significance in the gay community about the vulnerability of adolescence. So that conversation just inspired me to start approaching these young men in Binghamton. Also, so it's partly about sort of generally the vulnerability of adolescence, and also at this particular time in American life, when young people's futures seemed even more uncertain. And this subject, Jacob, I got to know and photographed a number of times. This was actually the first time that I met and photographed him. And he was about an 18-year-old kid that was spending his days walking up and down Main Street and trying to find work unsuccessfully, wanted to be a construction worker. He was very sensitive and really, kind of special person. And the idea of Main Street for me at that time, Main Street in the media was a kind of a metaphor for working class and middle class America. And I used Main Street as this kind of literal and metaphoric space to approach people. So I was continuing this process of just in this case, driving until I saw somebody interesting, and then stopping, and then coming up to them and saying, I'm working on a portrait series. about young men in Binghamton, and would you be interested in being photographed? And then these conversations would ensue. And in some cases, these are kind of fleeting experiences. In other cases, I got to know, I saw some of these young men more than once or twice and got to know them better. And they sort of opened up and told me things about themselves. And at that time, I was writing some of the sort of things that our conversations on my blog while I was posting this, and the work was in progress. And then this series was exhibited at Daniel Cooney in 2009 in a two-person show with a photographer named Francesca Romeo. And she had been for years a bartender at the Motor City Bar, and had been photographing her kind of milieu of friends and people she knew in that environment. And so our work was paired together. And when that project was over, I knew that I wanted to continue photographing people, and not necessarily young men specifically, but I didn't yet know where. And I started teaching at William Paterson University in the fall of 2009. So this is a year after the fall that I was spending in Binghamton. And on the way to William Paterson, which is in the suburb of a city called Paterson, I drove through Paterson and was really intrigued with this sort of historic American city that I previously actually didn't know about. But one thing that's very striking about Paterson is this incredible old architecture. Paterson was developed at the end of the 18th century, and it was America's first planned industrial city. It was envisioned by Alexander Hamilton and a group of entrepreneurs as an industrial city, partly because of its setting, which is at the foot of at the Great Falls of the Passaic River. And so it's a very stunning location. And for many centuries, Paterson was a prosperous industrial city and was known for silk manufacturing. And in the later part of the 20th century, in the 70s, its economy began to decline. And I saw the situation in Paterson as very relevant to other American cities, industrial. That's their economy was based on industry, and so particularly I was thinking about the photographers, of course, the FSA photographers who were making documentary work during a particularly fraught period in American life. So that was an inspiration. And I started making trips on the bus to Paterson and just walking on Main Street and the arteries off of Main Street. This portrait of Stacy is taken on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, which is one of the main streets in Paterson that intersects with Main Street. Stacy works at a hair salon, or worked at a hair salon, and she was waiting for the bus after work. So these first two are sort of in the early stages, and I actually just recently in May saw her again, and we remembered each other after 4 years. And many people that have come to photograph I see frequently, and it's just my experiences with each person I photographed is really unique to each of them, like how much time I spent with them, how well I got to know them. But over the course of what's now been 4.5 years, I've continued to make these trips, largely in the fall and spring, and I just walk for hours until I see people that I feel something about. And then I approach them and just simply say that I am a photographer from New York City and I'm working on a portrait series in Paterson, and I think you'd be a really interesting person to photograph. And sometimes I'll say something about what I notice about them. And many people, of course, say no, but I've also come to understand that how many people are intrigued or interested in participating in this and being photographed. There's something about being noticed, I think, and then there's a kind of a connection that's made. And I think that we create a kind of a short-term sort of intimacy in this experience. And this is Alexis, who's actually someone I would say has become really, of anyone I photograph, like a friend that I see frequently, and we have a very, very affectionate relationship. And yeah.
Quick question: when you, since you're talking about continuing relationships, do you also photograph them again over time, and does that change?
In some cases, yeah. I mean, in some cases that actually, I'm with Alexis, I have photographed him again, and that's the next photograph. But yeah, in some cases I photograph them more than once or twice. But again, it's different for each subject. And Alexis is has told me a lot about his story, and he's formerly identifies as a transgender person. He used to live in New York, and now he identifies as a gay man. And that led to a conversation about me asking, what's it like to be gay in Paterson, and him saying, girl, people love me, and he's really kind of wonderful spirit. And so that was in 2010, and this is just this spring that I have photographed him again. And oftentimes when I see him, we just talk. It's not like I only take pictures of him whenever I see him. So years have lapsed, and many conversations have taken place in between that first portrait and then this portrait this spring. But he had a difficult year and had recovered from pneumonia and was kind of starting to bounce back, and wanted to make another portrait. And this is an earlier portrait. Her name is Dorothy, and she was waiting at the bus station. And I think there was just something very quiet about this photograph and about her and about that moment that was intriguing to me. Miguel is a wrestler, and this was another earlier picture many years ago. And Kathy is another subject that I have developed more of a relationship with in time. This photograph was made the first time I met her, and I was very struck by her. And then as this picture sort of emerged as kind of the one that's been exhibited, and as this was exhibited at the Smithsonian, I came back to talk to her about that a number of times, and then ultimately brought her a catalog so she could see her portrait in that context. So we've also developed a relationship over these past couple years. And I saw her in May, kind of from a distance, and I thought about something. There's a documentary I show my students about Sally Mann, and she's talking about the pictures of her kids and saying how it was really the potency of her kids, their personalities, kind of the force of their personalities at that moment in time that kind of carried the portraits. And that went through my head, and I thought that was sort of true about Kathy. There was something about her potency as a person, her uniqueness and individuality that I had been so struck by, and that has kind of made that portrait. This portrait of Michael, I think I noticed him because I was intrigued by how elegantly dressed he was, standing outside this barber shop, and he told me that he was dressed up for his niece's graduation, and we talked for a bit, and I always wanted to use the barber shop as a backdrop. Largely with these photographs, I'm just focusing so much on the individual, and I'm not really trying to show a lot of the context, and I'm sort of suggesting the environment that they're in, but really trying to call attention to the subject and the sort of emotional impact. But I wanted to, the barbershop to me was so symbolic of Paterson, and you see those everywhere. So I was glad that it kind of made its way into one of these pictures. And Michael is actually one of the subjects that has become, we're friends on Facebook, and he made this his Facebook profile photo. So sometimes in my news feed, I see this picture periodically. And one thing I'll mention is that I have tried to bring these pictures back to the community in the sense that I make doubles in my contact sheets, and I make small prints. And I bring those with me, and if I see people again, or if I have their email address, I'll email them a picture. But I've tried to allow people the opportunity to actually see the portraits that we sort of made together. And Brandy is another subject that I've photographed a number of times. This was the first time I photographed her. She had actually approached me on the street, and she had seen me photographing other people, because at this point, Paterson's not that big of a city, and a lot of people are used to me being there and sort of know me as the photographer making portraits of people in Paterson. And so she actually asked me if I would photograph her, and she sort of opened up to me about some of her struggles with having been in prison and having been homeless. And later, since that first portrait, I have photographed her with two different partners that she's been with, and she has actually asked me, and it's sort of as a way to give back to her, I've taken pictures for her or for them. And this was this spring, and she is engaged to this guy, Steve, and she asked if I would take, these kind of engagement pictures. But there was one that worked for me, I guess, this portrait, in terms of really fitting into the project and being a sort of combined portrait of the two of them. And this is Nakia, who's also a hairdresser. A lot of Paterson's economy at this point is driven by the jobs in like restaurants and small businesses, and without the sort of industrial jobs that once were. The jobs that keep people going are working for the hair salons, electronic stores, many restaurants, and Nakia was standing outside work, and I just approached her and made this portrait. So all of these, of course, are there's a sort of active relationship between, they're all kind of a collaboration in a sense that I'm asking people. So nothing is caught. And this photograph of Marlon was made also on Dr. Martin Luther King Drive. This was made last spring. What's interesting to me is that this picture was actually made across the street from what's now a monument to Paterson's history as a stop on the Underground Railroad. And throughout working on this project, I did a lot of reading and sort of research about Paterson history, and also other artists and writers who've been interested in Paterson. One of the big ones for me was Junot Diaz, who wrote The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which is the protagonist of the character is a kind of a overweight science fiction geek who is sort of a failure at love, but this really, really big heart and wonderful character. And so that sort of underdog character was a kind of muse for me with the project. And this is the last picture that I made. This was just in May, and now that I'm leaving, it's been hard to figure out when this project is over, and I keep sort of feeling, I have felt for years the pull of continuing to return to this community. But now that I'm leaving, I think that the project is finally ending, and I'm sort of ending on this note. But this is one of my favorite portraits, and she was on her phone when I approached her, and she sort of only gave me just a few seconds of her time. It felt like these precious few seconds because, like most teenagers, she was very, distracted by her phone, and I can be guilty of the same thing. But I was really happy that I got one portrait that I thought she was so striking and beautiful and had a really strong presence, much like Kathy. And just to mention a few of the things that have happened with the project, or some of the organizations that have supported the project. The Smithsonian exhibited Kathy in the Outward Achiever Portrait Competition exhibition for a year. And I received the grant the support came from Humble Arts Foundation, Women Photography, and LTI Lightside. This was a couple years ago. And the photo review competition issue published Kathy and Jorge. And the series was included in Making Pictures of People, which brings together a selection of many contemporary photographers working in portraiture. And that was exhibited online on a website and also in a digital exhibition at the Nelson Atkins Museum. And finally, this spring, it's really been a big help. The CCNY provided a darkroom residency, and throughout my my years in New York, the CCNY has been a really important organization for me, and I really appreciate their support and hope that they find a successful new space. So beyond being a photographer, I've also been involved in writing about photography and curating, largely online. And for 4.5 years, I was the curator and writer for a arts website called Culture Hall, and I wrote a number of what we call feature issues. And this feature issue, America, was published on 4th of July in 2010. And these feature issues are like online group shows that bring together different artists surrounding a theme. So this theme of America was really, for me, photographers who were rethinking America through the lens of race and class and gender. And the Clayton Cotterell's work was about his brother returning from the war. Debbie Grossman's work, she made a body of work where she appropriated Russell Lee photographs, Depression-era photographs, and then used Photoshop to kind of manipulate the gender so that she envisions her Pie Town, my Pie Town, as a world exclusively populated by women, where women are sort of performing what were considered masculine roles. And then also Greg Reynolds' project Jesus Days, which he's going to be publishing this fall in a book where he is looking at old photographs, snapshots that he made in the 70s he was an evangelical missionary, and at that time he was in a very conservative environment, and he came to terms with his sexuality as a gay man. So he's sort of looking back at these snapshots he's made and seeing his sexuality emerge in these images. And then Mark McAndrews, who made portraits of working class people in jobs, in settings, traveling across America. And then in the summer of 2010, I went to Mexico with the photographer Juliana Beasley, documentary photographer, and we co-taught a workshop with emerging photographers based in Mexico with an organization called Toxico Cultura. And so I curated a show based on using four of these photographers' work. And one of them who's particularly interesting to me is Eunice Adorno, who photographed women in Mennonite communities. And that's also been published in a book called From Blom. And another one that is called Traces brings together work by Corinne Botts, and this is about artists sort of looking at spaces where there's sort of the impression of something that's sort of left behind. So Corinne Botts, Ayala Gazit, Megan Kump, and Paula Davila. Ayala had a brother commit suicide when she was a half-brother when she was very young, and she went back to Australia and made photographs in these in environments that he had lived in, and was sort of searching for traces of him. And Corinne had traveled around the country and photographed interiors and exteriors of places that sort of there was a surrounding ghost story. And Megan made images, self-portraits in a sense, in the woods but you sort of barely see her. She's just kind of a fleeting, like kind of a phantom. And Paula Davila photographed these kind of surreal domestic scenes, these sort of beds, and this one looks like it's underwater. And then this other places, I brought together work by different generations of LGBT artists making work about gay identity and community. Callie Connell manipulates images to kind of create these fictitious relationships and uses a subject, and then through Photoshop kind of creates these sort of ambiguous relationships. And then Molly Landreth made portraits of LGBT people across the country. This is Queer America. And Omar Gamas is a photographer based in Mexico City who photographed these places where men, congregate and sort of find some kind of relationship. And then Doug Ishar, who was my professor when I was in graduate school, who had made a documentary body of work about documenting gay beaches in Chicago in the 70s. It's one of the first gay beaches. So, and then this online exhibition was then exhibited at the CCNY in 2011. So this is the one that actually kind of made its way, though instead of Callie Connell, a photographer who teaches at Cal Arts, Kashila Brook, we showed her work. And I also now, Jill is here from PDN, and I work with her. She's an editor, and I write articles for each issue. And she seems to assign me articles that she thinks will sort of connect to my interests. So this is about a workshop that connects photo students with NGOs and nonprofits. Astoria Project is about students from the LaGuardia Community College who photograph their community, sort of looking for diversity in Queens, and then this has become a traveling exhibition. And this is an article about TEDx talks that are relevant to the photo community. And most recently, this year, I started writing for American Photo, and I feature exhibitions for something called On the Wall. So I research exhibitions, sort of, this is not a review in the sense that the exhibitions aren't up yet, but I look for what's going to be showing a few months ahead and try to find some of the most interesting exhibitions nationally, and then highlight those shows, about 10 or so of the shows, and then feature one. So this is the Home Truths, Motherhood and Identity at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. And Jen Davis' show this spring at Brian Clamp, as well as Richard Rinaldi, both of whom spoke here previously. And most recently, American Cool at the Smithsonian, and some other shows like the one at the ICP right now. So it's kind of a fun project to sort of explore what's out there and what's going to be. So that's it.
Did you use lighting for the portrait series?
No, it's all natural light, and I'm really just trying to find or work with the most interesting light I can without altering it, because I really want the photographs to communicate a sense of realism. So I've with all of the Paterson portraits or the Binghamton portraits, it's all natural light.
Tim, when you approach somebody, and do you introduce yourself and just like you said, you're a photographer from New York working on a portrait series? Is that it?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, I really just, I come up to someone and say, do you have a second? And can I talk to you for a second? And then just start this conversation, say, yeah, I'm a photographer from New York, and I'm working on a portrait series in Paterson, and I think you'd be a really interesting person to photograph. Do you have a few minutes? And then, sometimes we'll talk, and it's really like it's very, each interaction, each person I approach is sort of unique to each experience.
Do you think that's easier in a small town like that than it would be in New York?
I think so, yeah. I think, that's one thing I've thought about a lot. I think New York moves so fast that it would be harder to do something like this in New York. I mean, I think if you were just trying to catch something on the street, you can do that in New York, but I think it's harder to get people to slow down.
And stop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tema, what if, as far as these places, Binghamton and Paterson come to mind, what do you feel like you've learned about those places, and how have you learned more? You already described a little bit of the research that you've done. So. Well,
I mean, one thing I feel about Paterson is that I think it's hard to, I think people's lives can feel stuck, and I feel, and it's being there has been reinforced a sense that it's hard to sometimes kind of get out of struggles and a certain level of poverty, and that's something that I've seen, but at the same time I've also experienced that I think there's not a hopelessness, and that there are people in Paterson are living good lives too.
Hello, thank you for coming. How have you seen your role as a journalist and a curator? Have you seen that reflect in your work, or has it affected your work in any way?
Well, I mean, I think the things that I'm interested in, the things that I photograph, the themes in the photograph are connected and relevant to the things that I write about to some extent. So I feel like there's a very symbiotic relationship between being a photographer and then also writing about photography and even curating. And I think of curating as a very creative process.
The segment of the population that you've decided to focus on, have you considered looking at other segments of the population for compare and contrast to, for example, you're looking at people whom you consider, for lack of a better word, middle class, kind of stuck within their surroundings. Have you ever considered looking at another spectrum of society?
Well, in Paterson, I feel like who I photographed really accurately reflects who's there. And then I've tried to photograph a pretty wide range of people. So in downtown Paterson, the images you're seeing are really reflective of who lives in Paterson. So were I to do a different project, I think, you know, that it wouldn't necessarily be the sort of same group of people, but thinking about class and thinking about their situation was important to me with this project.
So are you going to extend to, as you move to Canada, and look at different segments of the Canadian population, somewhat akin to what you've done already?
I don't know.
Tema, I'm just wondering if you can talk just a little bit more about Paterson in terms of ideally how you would want this work to be shown. How would you structure a project like this that is one portrait after the other? I mean, I am struck by how consistent they are. They're very painterly. They're, you know, the backgrounds seem to be, as you said, very carefully sort of selected to reflect a little bit of the environment without taking away from the emotional intensity of the portrait. How do you see this project as an object to be presented?
Well, I mean, the most satisfying presentation I've had is to make it a sort of large-scale frame portrait that's almost life-size, so that when you confront the portrait, it almost feels as though you're standing across from the person or standing there with somebody. So having it presented as large framed prints together in a group would be sort of the ultimate presentation for me. I mean, of course, having it published as a book would be satisfying as well, but I really like to see them at a larger scale and have that kind of connection between looking at the portrait and sort of engaging with that almost as though the person is there.
And in the cases when you photograph the person multiple times, do you see them as being one next to the other, these iterations of the same person, or would you
well,
select
there's
just
really
one?
only a few. There's really actually only Alexis and Brandy that I've incorporated more than one photograph of them in the sort of selection of the project.
All right. Thank you very much, Tema.